My name is Caitlin McMullen, and I'm an associate professor of public administration at Aalborg University in Denmark. I've been doing research since October 2022 about the contribution of volunteers and nonprofit organizations to refugee integration services in Vienna. And today I'd like to present some preliminary findings from this ongoing research project and discuss some of the next steps and future directions for the project. As a bit of background to the project, my research thus far has looked at the role of nonprofit organizations in public service delivery and the notion of the involvement of citizens and service users in co-production. To explain what I mean by co-production, this is an idea that's usually presented as a contrast to a traditional model of public service delivery where professionals deliver services to service users as beneficiaries, while co-production relates to an approach of direct involvement of service users and volunteers as well in making decisions about the services they use and also contributing to delivering these services in different ways. So there's many ways that this may be undertaken, and an important point that I will discuss later on is the question of how, when, and whether to involve volunteers in delivering services or not. So the questions that I'm looking at with the research are first, how do nonprofit professionals involve volunteers and refugees in delivering integration services, or equally, when are they not involved and why are they not involved in different services in different areas? And second, what contribution do volunteers make to the creation of public value in this service area? And this perspective of public value is about the collective needs that are jointly defined by government and citizens, and recognizing that multiple stakeholders can create public value or destroy public value, and that this isn't just about something that government does through public service provision. But this is also quite a complex and contested area where there are potential value conflicts. So governments are driven both by values of security and protection, which create conditions for the exclusion of refugees, as well as a human rights frame based around justice and solidarity. So nonprofits obviously tend to be associated more with the human rights value coalition, but we have some tensions and challenges here in the types of value that we are trying to create and expected to create in the service area. So the first important question is, what do we mean by integration? What do I mean when I say refugee integration? And I'm studying the services and activities offered both during the asylum process as well as to refugees who have a legal status to remain. But integration is also about the strategy that refugee and local populations undergo in accepting cultural diversity and promoting equitable participation under one political system. So this is a question of adaptation and effort from both sides. In other words, it's not just about refugees adapting to their new society, but about the community being welcoming and adapting to support their integration. So as I said, this is quite a complex and politicized context, and it's about a public service that is not for people who have citizenship and rights in the same way. We can conceptualize refugee integration as four domains of essentially public value creation. So this is comprised of markers and means, social connection, facilitators, and a foundation of rights and citizenship. So this public value perspective helps us to understand the inputs of non-government actors. So the government cannot create all of these types of value on its own. We have a need for non-state actors, volunteers, citizens, and refugees themselves to collaborate. And this is where the co-production aspect becomes helpful and important, that we need to have this collaboration between different stakeholder groups. So I will go through what I mean by each of these domains of integration. So the first domain of integration is the idea of markers and means. So it's this question of how do we know that someone is integrated, and it's that they have access and are able to participate in society. So this includes housing, safety, the ability to feel at home, access to employment, economic independence and self-confidence, education, so the ability to gain skills and competence, and of course school is a very important context for the socialization of refugee children. And finally, health. So reliable access to health services, which is an engagement with a key government service as well. So the second area is that of social connections. So the building of bonds between refugees within their own communities and the building of bridges between refugees and locals as well. So this two-way kind of mutual accommodation between refugee and local populations. And this is where the role of nonprofits is so critical. So this is something that obviously cannot be achieved by government on its own because it's really about trust and relationship building, and it's not really a public service per se. So there's a lot of services that I heard about within nonprofit organizations in terms of mentoring and buddy projects, community centers and neighborhood centers offering people a space to go and just contribute to nice social activities to get to know other people. So lots of types of informal social activities to allow people the opportunity to get to know one another. Next are the facilitators of integration. So the question of how do we get there? And it's about language and cultural knowledge and safety and stability. So of course this is about learning the language of the new society that refugees are in, but also reducing the barriers to information. So translation is also really critical here. So the biggest area, of course, of service provision here is in German language learning. So official classes are, of course, offered publicly, but many of the nonprofits that I spoke to offer other types of supplements. So informal German cafes, language buddies, and opportunities to actually use the language with locals. And then on the other side, a lot of offers of translation and interpretation and ensuring that people have access to key information in their native language. Finally is the domain of foundation, so the rights and citizenship that is offered to individuals. So who is allowed to take part in the political community and the questions of human dignity, equality, freedom of culture, choice, justice, and security. So here the involvement of nonprofits is a little bit more limited because this is of course what the state offers, provides, or equally does not offer or provide. So what is the role of nonprofits in this? And obviously they make a huge contribution in supporting refugees with their basic needs, including housing, safety, health, and well-being, but also more broadly in filling gaps that are not met by the state in terms of more language and translation support, or the areas where the state cannot create value in terms of social connections, the bridges and bonds between people. But then the next question then is, what do volunteers contribute? So what kind of value are volunteers or refugee service users contributing to the creation of value for refugees in relation to their integration? So volunteers, both from a refugee background as well as local Austrians, support the delivery of many nonprofit services and activities in relation to housing, employment, education, and health. One example was a program of community health trainers where people with a migration background are trained to deliver information sessions on various public health topics that they do either in German or in their native language to be able to access different communities who have different types of health inequalities. But also many nonprofits that I spoke to offer counseling services for asylum seekers and refugees. And these are often done in collaboration between trained paid professionals and volunteers who act as interpreters. While some of the organizations I spoke to specifically hire people for paid positions with a migration or refugee background, so having people with lived experience as staff members rather than unpaid volunteers. Second, the role of volunteers is really critical in relation to the facilitators of language and cultural knowledge and safety and stability. So volunteers are involved in translation and interpretation, so people with a migration or refugee background who can help translate between German and their native language. But then lots of opportunities for volunteers to help refugees practice and learn German through buddy programs as well as German language cafes are a lot of examples there where volunteers are contributing a lot of value for refugee integration. And then in relation to social connection, this is where we see such an importance of volunteers, both refugees as well as local volunteers, in order to create the bonds and bridges between people. So this is often through more official programs of mentors and buddy projects, but also just opportunities for meeting each other in community centers and social activities. So I would say that this isn't always about official volunteering, but sometimes about creating the opportunities for people who would not necessarily connect with one another to meet and to become friends and to build these social bonds. So volunteering is important here, but it's also about kind of having the space for people to meet each other on the same level. And finally, volunteers are not directly able to create the space for rights and citizenship for refugees. So this is an area where I would say that co-production doesn't make as much sense in terms of a concept. But there are a lot of examples of volunteers getting engaged in advocacy and lobbying and trying to promote the rights of refugees vis-a-vis the government. So a lot of opportunity for local citizens to get involved and support this in a different way beyond service provision. A quote from one participant in the research I think tells an interesting story about the role and impact of refugee and local volunteer involvement. And what they said was, "We always had German training, but we kind of enlarged our program a lot. Our impression was what's needed is this kind of connecting with the locals. So giving people a chance to practice and at the same time connect to locals, because there's so much you don't understand about a country if you first just come there, and that is only accessible really by talking to people or interacting with locals." From these groups, we got people who wanted to get involved and do volunteer work because after a while, it felt for them like this was their space as well. We tried to make them aware that we're not a service center where you go and you kind of just buy in, but you're part of the organization if you come here. Even if it's small things like help us put everything back or prepare everything for the groups or make the coffee. And what this shows is that involvement isn't simply about supporting German language acquisition, but that the impacts seem to be broader. So we can see that people make connections in the German language program and become more involved in volunteer work. And this is something that leads me on to my next point from the research. One of the things I think is so important is the way that these domains of integration intersect and build upon one another. And this is where I think the most compelling stories of nonprofits' services and activities are told. So first is these intersections between the domains and how they build upon one another. And the foundation of rights as a building block towards the other domains is really critical. So what asylum seekers are offered during their legal asylum process, as well as the rights and secure legal status afterwards, are instrumental in enabling integration. But without these rights, it's very difficult to access any of the other domains of integration. So, of course, when you do not yet have legal status, it's impossible to access employment, but also getting access to language and cultural knowledge, education, and housing is really challenging. So many people told me stories about how the lack of a foundation, as well as lack of markers and means of integration, made it difficult for people to progress in the other domains. So for people in a precarious housing situation or with poor health, how are you really going to be able to go to school, to go to language classes, or build friendships? Similarly, how are people really expected to participate in programs if they don't have sufficient language skills? Or how are they expected to participate in education or classes if they're dealing with poor housing? So these really feed upon one another. It's really critical to have a more holistic perspective that takes into account the interrelationships between the facilitators, foundation, markers and means, and social connections perspectives. But then on the more positive angle, there's something about a ripple effect between these different domains of interaction. So what I mean by this is the kind of broader impacts or implications of an intervention, or how one type of value or domain of integration actually builds upon the others. So these kind of more positive intersections between the domains. So integration services can have ripple effects for refugees themselves, as well as for local citizen volunteers who are inspired by the opportunity and extend their involvement or use their experience as a stepping stone into other realms of volunteering, engagement, or advocacy. So for instance, the quotes that I gave before of the involvement in language classes, through this, people make friends, they build social connections, and they start getting involved in other volunteering activities. So this creation of value is cumulative. So the volunteers or the process of volunteering supports a more holistic creation of value rather than focusing on one domain at a time. So we can't really think of the kind of siloed public service delivery approach, but rather this is more about looking at an entire person and the types of links that they need. So I'd like to just offer some final conclusions, other themes that came out of the research, and some thoughts about future directions for the project. So first was the theme that refugee integration really requires an involvement from both sides. So both from refugees for their own integration path, as well as some degree of involvement of locals as volunteers, as buddies, or whatever, to create a more inclusive and welcoming society. And I think this is so important because from a public service perspective, this is not something that can be offered purely by the government, but there's such an important involvement of nonprofits and volunteers. Second is that many people mentioned differences between working with refugees who came through the 2015, 2016 waves and Ukrainian refugees over the last couple of years. And this is in part because of the different rights that are afforded to these different groups, but also different expectations of long-term settlement between these refugee communities. And this really impacts the services that nonprofits offer, as well as their approaches to volunteer involvement. Third is this constant issue of policy and funding, and of course this is an issue in all areas of nonprofit service provision, but refugee integration in particular. This is such a highly politicized area, so it's impossible for volunteer involvement in service delivery to be purely apolitical in the way that it might be in other areas, such as working with elderly people or cleaning up parks or something like that. And then finally, some questions that arose was about whether or not it's appropriate or desirable to involve volunteers in activities. So not all of the nonprofits that I spoke to involve volunteers, and some do this through a matter of kind of principle that asserts that social work and counseling work should not be deprofessionalized through the involvement of volunteers. So this raises the question then of what volunteers should be doing and what shouldn't they be doing. And a final question is building upon this idea of the kind of intersections and ripple effects, is how can we measure or evaluate the ripple effects of integration activities? This is a question that I hope to continue studying in the next stages of the research. So thank you so much for your attention today. I would be so grateful if you have any comments or suggestions on what I've presented, or if you are interested in taking part in future stages of the research.